Hello, my name is Solomon Wangwe. I'm the MD and founder of Goshen Acquisitions Limited, as well as its wholly owned subsidiary GrandAcres Limited. In this CTA classing session, I'm going to be sharing with you specific steps to take to safely and competently buy and invest in land in Kenya. There's so many reasons for why you should invest in land in Kenya. First of all, as a Kenyan, I feel one has a responsibility to own their country. We would have no country without its land. And, land is the base for everything, including our very existence, if you believe certain philosophies or teachings. But, I'd say that's the first one. The other is, if you're looking to build a sustainable, financially stable future for yourself and your heirs, your successors, you cannot ignore land. It's the beginning of everything. It's also the safest way to hold long-term wealth and pass it along to future generations. Also, historically in Kenya, land has performed better than any other asset class available.
When you say that, what does that mean?
That means if you compare returns on a cumulative year-on-year basis between, say, stocks and bonds,
crypto.
Well, I don't think crypto has been long enough to compare in the same way, from 1963 at least. But if you compare that to other ways to invest in land, nothing has performed better than land. Property investments, specifically on land, developed property tends to have, cyclicals up and down, but still cumulatively over time, it's been on an upward trajectory. And so, along with that, I would say, if you look at the basics of economics, I've shared this before, there's more human beings being born on a daily basis. Historically, we've never had as many human beings on this planet as we do today. And the land is not expanding or being created anymore. So on the basics of pure economics, it's a diminishing commodity. There's more of us requiring more space. That puts pressure on the use and desire for the land, which guarantees its future value, because more of us will be wanting it. So if you look at that and all the other reasons I mentioned, there's plenty of reasons to own land in Kenya. Of course, Kenya is a stunning country, beautiful for investment purposes, tourism, or even just for nostalgia. I know certain people who buy land just because of how it makes them feel, depending on where it's at. It's on the lakefront, it's on the beachfront. There's a million reasons why you should own land in Kenya.
And from a Goshen Acquisitions perspective, you've talked about it being an asset class that constantly is appreciating. Goshen has been in the industry for 10 years. Has that been the case with the land that you have bought?
1,000,000%, yes.
What kind of returns would you say that has shown?
Generally, the longer you hold land, the greater gains you will realize. Even if you're not selling, just in terms of value growth and appreciation, the longer you hold, the better off you do. For instance, for us, I think the most dramatic one would be Konza, where we're still holding a 10-acre block of land. We purchased back then, I think, for about 320,000 shillings an acre. And today, people are paying north of 4 million shillings an acre.
Ooh.
So if you look at that sort of return over 10 years,
10x.
yeah, it's 12 plus, 13, 14 times.
And with the development that's happening in Konza, that is guaranteed to constantly shoot up.
Absolutely. So, you compare that with other asset classes, it's difficult to beat because it's also passive. We haven't done a single thing to the piece of land. We simply bought it and we've been holding its title. So other asset classes also might require a bit more involvement, further effort from you after you've made the investment. depending on what exactly it is. But when you look at passive income or value growth opportunities, it's virtually impossible to compete with land.
Okay, is that where the phrase land banking comes from?
Yes, so land banking traditionally was a term reserved for governmental intervention and activities around controlling land ownership for future use. I believe this probably started in Europe, likely in the UK or Great Britain, where governments would project future use and demand for land based on population growth, rural urban migration trends, and economic trends and the likes, and they would hive off reserves of land to allow for settlements to expand.
Ooh, okay.
Over time that has become used by people in the industry like us, or just people on the streets, to signify or to mean that you're putting your long-term savings, stockpiles of cash, into land as opposed to holding it in cash, right? And there's many reasons for that. Again, over time, land generally appreciates because it's a diminishing commodity. If you buy in the right location at the right time, your spikes in value can be very dramatic, right? And then if you throw in assessments of inflation in terms of currency, if you're going to hold 1 million shillings over 20 years, that 1 million shillings 20 years later is going to buy you way less than it would have bought you 20 years ago.
True.
Whereas if you converted the 1 million shillings into a piece of land over 20 years, not only have you shielded yourself from the inflationary effects of the devaluation of the cash and what it can do for you, it's also increased in value. In many cases, superseding the inflation ratio. So it's a synonymous term for banking your cash in land holdings for the long term.
Just before we get into the details of how to go about acquiring a piece of land, I just would like to hear from you, who should then buy land in Kenya?
Who should buy?
Yeah.
I mean, for starters, Kenyans should be buying land in Kenya. If you're a Kenyan citizen by birth or by, naturalization, why wouldn't you own a piece of your own country? I'm a bit extremist in this regard, but I find there's something very unpatriotic about being Kenyan and not owning a piece of Kenya. So what makes you Kenyan at the end of the day?
Ooh.
Yeah.
Ouch.
I mean, look at our history. Colonization was centered all around land.
It's true.
Land control and ownership. And even when it was given back to us on paper, in many instances, in reality, on the basis of law, the land in many parts of the country is still owned by foreigners.
It's true.
So, if you're a Kenyan citizen, you ought to own a piece of Kenya. I get it. Some of us are fortunate enough to inherit land from our forefathers, our parents, our grandparents, and so on. But not everyone has that opportunity. And even if you did, I feel there's a sacred responsibility by each and every one of us to add to that ownership, as opposed to waiting for it to get handed down. But like I said, I'm a bit extremist about that view on who should own land, but that's a beginning. Anyone looking to invest in Kenya, at some point will have to own the land. Yes, you could get away with leasing land and using it for a particular period of time for what you require, but I believe at some point, as your capital exposure increases, your risk goes up. Therefore, your inability to claim ownership to the piece of land that you've based your production on becomes a problem.
Yep.
So you have to own the land. And we see this happening in urban parts of Kenya. Nairobi is a prime example. It's the one everyone understands. Parts of the coast, Malindi is famously mostly Italian, at least as far as the desirable commercial beach frontages are concerned. There are certain parts of Malindi where you find signage in Italian. Same thing is happening in Nairobi now, places like Kilimani, where you have road signs and all manner of signages in Chinese. What does that tell you? People are possessing the land. If you don't own the land, the building you put up on it becomes a risk.
And I've seen cases like that happen. Let me ask this question just before we go into the next question, as a follow-up of who should own the land in Kenya.
Yeah.
Is it legal for foreigners, people who do not possess Kenyan ID or who are not Kenyans, to own land in Kenya? Is it legal for foreigners, people who do not possess Kenyan ID or who are not Kenyans, to own land in Kenya?
It is, as long as it's a leasehold. The piece of land or the property has a leasehold tenure. And basically that means, and there's two tenures in Kenya, freehold and leasehold. Freehold constitutionally is restricted only to Kenyan citizens, whether naturalized or by birth. Only Kenyan citizens can own freehold land. Leasehold land can be owned by anyone. Land and property can be owned by foreigners as well, which is exactly why places like Kilimani are now loosely referred to as Chinatown, because the Chinese community has focused their investments in that particular zone. And it's not random either. It's very coordinated, and for good reason. And I don't want to give people the impression that it's wrong for the Chinese or any other nationality to own land in Kenya and buy property. It's one of the bases of our economic strength. Historically and worldwide today, if you look at the strongest economies, they have very robust property rights that even protect the rights of the foreigner to own property. If you don't have that sorted out, you're going to limit your economic capacity as a country.
What you're doing is limiting entry into the country.
Foreign direct investment is directly affected by that, and all other manner of economic unlocking opportunities happen as a result. So, as long as it's leasehold, foreigners can own, and indeed is happening already.
And to laymanly explain what leasehold means, please explain that.
So leasehold tenure means you have ownership of land for a limited period of time, right? And I know the term lease suggests renting, is what people understand leasing to be, but you have ownership rights. So if I buy a piece of land with a leasehold title or certificate of title, it means I have full ownership rights for the period of time that the lease says. Most new ones will start at 99 years and they are renewable. So at the end of 99 years, I have the option to renew my lease for another 99 years or whatever the law says at that point.
And the constitution did change that from 999 years and brought it down to 99 years.
Yes, rightfully so. I believe with changing times and pressure on land need, the country and the lawmakers rightly saw fit to limit the tenure of ownership from what was in colonial times up to 999 years. I mean, over that period of time, the human population would have exploded. And if you have a handful of people controlling the land, that's a recipe for disaster. So that was shrunk down to 99 years. And so if you're a foreigner and you're looking to own land in Kenya, that's a tenure you would have to own the land or the property under.
What areas is leasehold available as compared to freehold?
In any part of the country, you can own leasehold property. It is true that most of Kenya is currently under freehold tenure because rural parts of the country were generally used for agricultural purposes as a production base. And freehold tenure, or I should say agricultural land, generally falls under freehold tenure. And there's good reason for that. You don't want to subject your citizens or your countrymen to paying annual taxes for their main production base for survival. You know, most farmers in Kenya are subsistence farmers, meaning they use the land to grow their food and stay alive. So it doesn't make sense to subject those to annual taxes. So historically, there was a reason, there was a rationale behind that. But you know, today you have huge tracts of land that have been converted to lease by foreign companies. For instance, I know people will recognize companies like Del Monte and the others. Those are operating on leased land, long-term leases, you know, from the county as well as the national government. So it is not unusual to find leasehold property even in rural Kenya. You have the option to convert your freehold land to lease for the purposes of transferring it to a foreigner.
Whoa.
So that can happen. We're in the process of doing that right now for one of our customers who has foreign nationality, and therefore our freehold land in Imbuko we have to convert to leasehold before we can transfer to them legally. So that is easy to do. Where you have challenges is the inverse. Changing leasehold to freehold is a bit more difficult.
Thank God.
Yeah, and the main reason I believe is because the government authorities are looking at the potential loss of future tax income.
Okay.
If they allow you to convert, I'm sure it's possible. It's just incredibly difficult.
So still to stay with this whole leasehold versus freehold, on leasehold, there are taxes that are due to the government or the county.
Yes.
As a result.
Yes. So for leasehold, there's several taxes. We'll start with the transfer tax. When you buy the land or when it's transferred to you, provided it's not an inherited piece of land and a gift from that perspective, you have to pay a transfer tax called a stamp duty paid to the Kenya Revenue Authority as a tax for the movement of ownership from its previous owner to yourself or from yourself to the next person, right? So that's the first tax. The second one is gonna be while you own it. There's rates. Rates are paid to the county government, and rents are paid to the national government. And rent is where you have the biggest distinction between leasehold and freehold, because freehold land cannot be subjected to rent paid to the national government. It's possible in some counties to be subjected to rates on freehold, but that is dependent on the county in our practical experience even now. But leasehold is subjected to both rates and rents, and those are annual, and they're usually very nominal. It's a small percentage of whatever the government deems to be its value at the time. There's many changes going on now in Kenya around resetting the valuation base from 30 years ago to what it should be today, and rightfully so. It basically means people will have to pay a little bit more than they're used to on an annual basis or for rates and rents. So that covers it too while you own it. And then of course, when you sell, presumably you've sold for a profit.
Yep.
You will be subjected to a capital gains tax. Right? And that is a certain percentage of your net profits the government wants a share of. I believe currently it's at 5% as capital gains tax, provided it's not in a gazetted area for that. We, for instance, as a land trading company, are exempted from capital gains tax because we are registered as a trader. Our land is treated as inventory, not as an investment, right? So certain classifications of tax registrations are exempted from that. But as an individual, if you're going to hold that piece of land for a significant amount of time, enough to realize a gain, you need to plan for that capital gains tax, and that covers the 4 basic taxes. The first one when you buy, the 2 while you own, and the 4th one when you sell.
Okay, love it.
Yeah.
Now that we know that, let's get to answer. Are these guys making us? Good, wonderful. Let's get to the second question. We now know why it is that we must buy. Let's talk about how. How do I know where to buy land in Kenya? Let's get to the second question. We now know why it is that we must buy. Let's talk about how. How do I know where to buy land in Kenya?
Well, that's a really good question, and I'm sure there's many answers to that. How do you know is mostly a question of investigation. Assuming, first of all, you have the desire to own, that's a very critical first step. It's difficult to force someone to own land if they have no desire to. So the interest, the desire is the first key, because depending on what your goal is, you will focus on absorbing information about your specific goal. If I want to farm, for instance, there's certain areas of the country I will not bother looking. If I want to build apartments for rental income at a particular yield, there's certain parts of the country that are immediately disqualified from consideration.
If you want to retire.
Absolutely. If you want to retire,
by coastal.
Yes.
That automatically limits.
Absolutely. Then you're limited to the eastern side of the country at the coast. So how to find out is mostly a question of your own research, asking around. Most of us find out by hearing from people we like and respect about something they bought somewhere, or something that they heard, or an announcement by the government about some giant project, as we witness in Konza. For instance, created a massive influx of investors because of what the government was about to do there. Same thing has happened in Lamu. Because of the port. Same thing is happening now with the dry inland port in Naivasha. In Kisumu, with the plans to do cold chain facilities to support the economic base there. Same thing is happening. So there's various ways to sort of get that on your radar, and that's how you start.
Okay, let's take it from Goshen Acquisitions, GrandAcres perspective, where you look for strategic land investments, if I'm not wrong, with the intention.
We try to be strategic
for greater gains. Basically, I want to buy this now. I want to sell it in 5-10 years at a profit. I want that 10x that I had you talk about.
Yeah.
How do I start looking?
So, if I'm going to approach it from Goshen Acquisitions perspective,
yes,
there are basically 3 main criteria we like to use. The first is going to be proximity to Nairobi. So we like to be within a 2.5 to 3 hour driving radius of the capital city.
Why is that?
That's because it's easier to manage. If you have to visit the site, if you have to do this, that, or the other, you don't want to be on the road all day to get there, because it makes it a lot more difficult to manage and do what you need to do.
Okay.
Now, if it's a place where we can fly to fairly inexpensively, like Kisumu and the coast, then obviously your radius can get much wider.
Okay.
But in terms of driving, we don't like to be beyond 3-hour radius. So we're limited in terms of where to consider. Someone offered us some land in Embu recently, and Embu takes slightly longer than 3 hours to get to if you're driving sanely. So immediately I didn't even have to think about it. I just said, no, we wouldn't be interested. It doesn't work. And it's not inexpensive to fly to Embu if you had to fly. You'd have to charter a flight or use a chopper.
There's no airport.
Yes,
yeah.
That's a different economic prospect. So 2.5, 3 hour driving radius. Second thing is we like to be next to impending developments. Konza Techno City, at the coast, Lamu. At some point we even considered buying land in Isiolo because of what was planned for the tourism city, similar to Konza but for the tourist sector. So impending developments, whether on a massive public scale like that or a smaller scale on a private basis, those are an important indicator for where we should be considering, because that means the area will experience a sudden spike in interest because of the value that's being invested there, which is very intuitive. The third thing we like to look for is unique geographic features.
Hold on. Yeah, sure. I can tell them to stop. Okay, sir. Okay, no problem. He's on with the earphones.
Yeah.
Are you okay though? Okay. The third.
So the third thing we like to look for.
Just take it again. 3, 2, 1.
So the third thing we like to look for is unique geographic propositions, and by that I mean things that existed in nature that are virtually impossible to recreate.
Mountains.
Mountain views. Lakes. Although we've seen the Arabs in the UAE do insane things like create new islands and the likes. But we like to look out for those. And the reason is those, in essence, will generally guarantee a certain amount of desire from the marketplace for the long term, no matter what is happening in the area, right? People generally like to be next to a water body. They like mountain views. They like to be on a cliff with the vistas and unique things of that kind. So those are the three things we like to look for to determine where. Yeah, that could vary from person to person or even company to company. For a company that's interested in developing land, building stay student housing, our criteria goes out the window. Yeah, you have to be in densely populated areas near educational institutions and blah blah blah. If you're looking to do large scale farming, a bunch of our criteria goes out the window as well.
Yep.
So your goal for investing would basically guide the rest of the journey for you.
Okay, so now that I'm sort of hearing what makes Goshen, and what I'm telling from this, it's vast. There's no one script fits all.
Absolutely.
It all comes down from what's your goal.
Yeah.
Hence, therefore, where do I look for? What's next now? From the moment Goshen is able to discover a plot like in Nyanyuki or a plot like by the coast band, by the mountain, what's the next stage? What's next now? From the moment Goshen is able to discover a plot like in Nyanyuki or a plot like by the coast band, by the mountain, what's the next stage?
So we go about scouting. So we've identified a general area, right? Based on our criteria. We spend a lot of time scouting. That generally happens to be 30% of my daily tasks.
Your JD.
Yes, my job description. I spend a lot of time scouting. I love the process of scouting. I get to discover new parts of the country I never saw before. I get to learn things about our history, the communities that live in those particular areas. It's a fun process for us, so it's easy. But that's what you'd have to do. You know, a lot of people who may not have time to do that because they have a permanent vocation somewhere, they're employed. You know, I, in essence, get paid to scout. That's part of the business. For someone who doesn't have that opportunity, they rely on companies like us to sort of point them in the right direction. Whether it's companies like us that only sell what we own, because unlike agents and or brokers, we never act as a third party for any transaction.
Why don't you do that? Why don't you broker land on behalf of the owner of the land?
It just it doesn't feel right. You know, in Kenya is famous for land fraud. I'll put it that way. And a lot of that is perpetrated by parties that have no real interest in the transaction. And by real, I mean they don't own the land and they're not the one risking the money.
Okay.
So the middlemen in between have been very problematic. And the primary reason for that, in my humble opinion, is that it's an unregulated market. We don't have laws governing land brokerage or agency. You know, I had someone's house help the other day trying to broker a multi-million-dollar transaction. And I'm like, what on earth does he know about the risks involved for the seller or the buyer? They're simply looking for a payday in between, and that's been very problematic. And we just didn't want the association at all. We didn't want to risk our customers' investments by sort of midwifing a transaction, getting paid a commission. We move on and then they have issues later because we had no visibility on the history of ownership, how it was produced. Was it grabbed from public land? Was it stolen from someone? Are there succession issues behind that? We just didn't want any of that. So we made a decision pretty early that we would only sell what we owned ourselves because we can back up the ownership documents.
Oh, okay. Let's now then let's stick to this whole scouting.
Yes.
Because that's what you say is like your 30% of your JD.
Yes.
At Goshen Acquisitions and GrandAcres.
Yeah.
So let me take one of the properties that I know you have, Nyanyuki. What do you go and look for? Well, let's use Imbuko. Because that sounds like, even where on earth is it? Right. It almost sounds like that. Like
I saw a wine bottle on a shelf recently, and it said Imbuko, and I was so excited. I thought it was, you know, it was made in Kenya, but you know, it's a South African wine. There's a place in South Africa apparently also called Imbuko.
Yeah.
But the Imbuko we're referring to is in southern Kajiado County, towards the Amboseli ecosystem, about 40 to 50 kilometers before. That's an important thing to mention because a lot of people hear us say South Kajiado, they immediately assume that we're selling grab land from Amboseli, which sadly happens from time to time, or within the feeder corridors that have very tight restrictions. We're not in that zone, but we are on that corridor from Emali town, which is about 124 kilometers from Nairobi, specifically from Nyayo Stadium roundabout, down Mombasa Road to Emali, 124.
It's less than 3 hours, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. It takes about an hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes to get to Emali from Nyayo Stadium.
Okay.
And then we branch down towards Oloitoktok, New Tarmac Road, about 33 kilometers down. So that's southern Kajiado. There specifically, you know, again, this is some of the unplanned ways you discover places. We bought some land from a Maasai gentleman, Mzee Daniel Oletapasian, from Konza. He was a native of Konza, Kajiado side of Konza, because Konza is shared by two main counties, Kajiado and Makueni. Makueni, in some areas, Machakos also has a claim. But he's on the Konza side, which is Kajiado. Kajiado side rather, which is Maasai. And he sold us some land. We finished the transaction. He was so happy because apparently he had had several aborted sales before we came along. And because of that, his family heard that he had concluded the transaction, painlessly. And therefore, would your buyer want to buy ours also from Mimbuko? And so he pestered us for 3 months to go and see and buy. Eventually, I reluctantly agreed to, just out of respect for the old man. And I went to take a look. I fell in love with the place immediately. I'd never been to that side of the country.
Okay. When you say you fell in love, what did you fall in love with? Because I'm sure this is part of the scouting.
Yes. So the distance happened to be, 2.5 hours for driving, which it didn't feel like far. That's important. If you get tired going to the place, might be an indication it'll be a problem for you to manage.
Okay.
Accessibility is important. So it was a 2.5 hour drive, very scenic, especially when you turn off of Mombasa Road. You have wide open landscapes. I can see into Tanzania, 100 kilometers away from there. I mean, that was stunning. Coming from, the congestion of Nairobi, it felt like a decompression. And there was something about that I found very therapeutic and beautiful. And so when we finally got to the site, Mount Kilimanjaro was fully exposed in all of her glory. And that Mount Kilimanjaro is famous for being a very shy mountain, because I suppose of its imminence as the tallest freestanding mountain on the planet.
On the planet?
Yeah, it's the tallest freestanding mountain in the world.
Okay.
A lot of people don't know that.
I didn't know that.
It tends to have a lot of cloud cover. And it's a natural consequence of how tall it is, the water catchment activities and so on. But on this particular day, it was out in the open, and I had never seen that, ever. I mean, I'd seen posters and paintings. I think every household in Kenya has a painting of Mount Kilimanjaro hanging on a wall. But that was stunning. It took me aback, and I immediately knew I wanted a piece of that.
Okay.
And so that's how we discovered Mbuko. Was nowhere in our peripheral.
I'm sure
never
you didn't
heard
even
of
know.
the place.
I was going to say that.
Yeah, I'd never been to that side of the country. I'd never been to the Amboseli National Park, so I never had any reason to be on that side of the country. My mom is from Central Kitui, which we access through Thika. My dad is from Western Kenya, in Webuye. So I know tons of places along those corridors, but I had never been to this part of the country. So in that instance, I sort of accidentally discovered Mbuko and fell in love with the place.
I've got to ask this, because what you mentioned is huge and maybe a restriction as to why people don't even invest in Kenya. You are investing out of your own, let me use the word, tribe. Without fear of consequences.
Yes. I'm only now realizing how debilitating this fear is for Kenyans. I mean, I grew up in Nairobi, very cosmopolitan. I went to school in the States, lived in the US for 11 years. US is famous for being a melting pot of all manner of cultures. So I don't have a lot of the baggage that many Kenyans have around investing outside of their ethnic zones. And I didn't understand that until recently. I mean, I do understand we have ethnicity issues, tribalism and blah, blah, blah. Post-election violence that happened in Kenya scarred a lot of Kenyans and created a lot of fear about investing outside of your ancestral zones. But I've only just now begun to come to terms with how many Kenyans are affected psychologically by that. So for us, it's never been an issue. And so I feel like because of that, we tend to discover new zones faster than people. Most people do. And I wish that would change, honestly. I believe it will over time. The Constitution now from 2010 guarantees every Kenyan the right to invest anywhere in the country.
I love that.
Regardless of their ethnicity or ancestral origins. And people need to know that. But I guess subsequently, that's a need we're serving, where when we released our first offering in Imbuko, people who had never been there, like I hadn't been there 10 years before, were now discovering the place because they'd never had a reason to go there.
I get it.
And so I think that's an important psychological adjustment people have to make. If you're going to invest and be savvy about investing and get in on the ground floor, as it were, so that you can build wealth in the maximum possible way, you have to remove those shackles from your mind. It's
so
a
basically,
mindset.
when you're saying get in at the ground floor, say get it for the cheapest that it will ever be.
Yes, I always say make money when you buy, not when you sell.
Explain that.
Right, and it basically means in general, the first way to do that is you buy below market value. And there are several ways to buy below market value. You buy from a distressed seller. Distressed sellers are people who are going through some form of crisis and urgently need money, and they have decided to sell off the asset at whatever price they can get now, as opposed to waiting.
I love that.
So therefore they can sell at a discount.
The person who called you to Imbuko was distressed.
In a manner of speaking, yes. Yeah. They needed money for school fees. I believe, as is common in the Maasai culture, he was ready to marry another wife and needed to buy cattle for bride price. Also wanted to buy more cattle for himself. The Maasai community have a very different value system, as it were, and it's very culture specific. Yep. They're a very communal community, which I love about them. I don't understand some of the reasons and the rationale for how they deal with their assets, because other communities value land more than gold even, and would never sell. Whereas there's certain instances where a Maasai will sell land because whatever they want to take care of is more important to them. And there are certain universal situations that make all of us motivated. A sick family member, mounting hospital bills, school fees is one of those. And so that makes you a motivated seller, and you're willing to take slightly less than the market value because you can do it now as opposed to waiting to do it later.
Okay.
So that's the first way you make money when you buy. You buy it at a discount, because when you're done buying, it's more valuable than what you paid. Right?
Even if you have to sell it immediately that you bought it, you can sell it for.
You can sell it for more, as opposed to having to wait for the value to go up. The other way to buy, to make money when you buy, is to be strategic. You buy like we did in Konza, near the Konza Techno City development. 13 months later, the then President Mwai Kibaki broke ground. And all of a sudden, everyone and their grandmother was hunting for land around Konza for obvious reasons. And we were able to sell for a significantly higher price than we had bought just 13 months prior, right? Had we waited for the normal trajectory, we might have waited 10 years, 5 years, at the least, for the valuations to get up there. But because of that significant nationally televised event, very well branded, part of the Vision 2030 sort of agenda, its value suddenly went up because more people wanted it than there were selling. So that's another way to make money when you buy, not when you sell necessarily, because you can generally project its higher value in a short-term basis than what you're paying now. Another great way to make money when you buy is to add value immediately. And this is what companies like us do. We tend to do a combination of all those things, including buying
quantity.
Quantity.
The more quantity you also buy,
the lower the price per acre.
You have more bargaining power.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If I'm buying 100 acres, I can be a bit more aggressive on the price because of the quantum of capital that's being exchanged than if I was just buying a 1 acre or 5 acre block. On top of that, I add value immediately.
And when you talk about adding value, you're talking about roads. Give us example. What do you mean?
So basic infrastructure, that's a prime area of focus for us in improving or creating accessibility, right? So road surface that is all weather, for instance, is important. Before, we simply used to clear the pathways to allow vehicles to move through the land, but in the rainy seasons in certain parts of the country that's impossible because it's too muddy. So therefore, what else do you do to make sure that you can use the road in the thickest of the or the heaviest of the rainy season, right? So marraming the roads, doing clear boundary demarcations, also master planning your subdivision, as it turns out, has value. Instead of just chopping a piece of land into squares and rectangles, planning their layout using a professional planner and even an architect in a way that is pleasing to the eventual users and owners in terms of circulating and having public areas and shared spaces, that tends to add value. It makes it a lot more desirable. So these are some of the ways we add value ourselves.
But in the process of trying to add value, you will lose out on land. For example, if I buy a 100 parcel and I'm going to add value through adding roads, through calling some areas communal, that automatically means I don't have 100 plots to sell. Yes. I'll probably only have 70 or 80. Is this something that you've gone through, and is the addition in terms of the value add, does it make sense?
Absolutely. I mean, I'll give you a live example. In Imbuko, for instance, we're currently selling 1 acre plots. These were subdivided from an 88 acre block, right? We have 80 subdivisions because 2 of them are 2 acres instead of 1 for the public utilities. So if, let's assume those 2 were also separate titles, basically we would have 82 1 acre plots out of 88 acres. And that's because of all the areas that went towards the road access. So in general, you're looking at about 10% going to accessibility. If you give enough width and space for the roads and for expansion in the future, if you give up space for utilities and public use for the compound, that can go up to 12, even 15% at the highest. So yes, you lose some, but in general, how we treat that is whatever value we have lost to public access for the benefit of the others, we subdivide equally amongst the others. So the value doesn't disappear. It just simply makes the others slightly more expensive because you're transferring value there, because what you have given up is to create accessibility and optimal use for them anyway. So, you know, issues of giving up land should not matter. In actual fact, creating the accessibility and public utility makes what you have subdivided a lot more valuable.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's a simple example for adding value.
I love it. I love the jumping that we're doing, because you're definitely dropping a lot of. You're taking us to class as
I
we
guess
have the conversation.
If someone wants to get in the business of land development,
which is
absolutely,
which I didn't even expect the conversation to go into, but that's wonderful. So you've scouted, you've decided this is, whoa, I didn't see this land, I didn't think a land like this existed. I want. Now you press the button on I want.
Right.
What's the next stage?
So
how basically I'm asking, how do I start then? So you've scouted, you've decided this is, whoa, I didn't see this land, I didn't think a land like this existed. I want. Now you press the button on I want.
Right.
What's the next stage?
So
how basically I'm asking, how do I start then?
Yeah, so now you get into the nitty-gritties of documentation, due diligence, and so on. So I'd say first thing you want to do is do your due diligence on the piece of land. Along with that, you will end up doing due diligence on the landowner. So basic things I like to look for when I'm checking out, that's what due diligence means. You're doing your research and making sure that you have all the information responsibly that you need to make a decision to pull the trigger by sending money to an escrow account and the likes. Is the land easily accessible? Where is it located relative to the closest road, the closest tarmac road? If it's far removed from the tarmac road, what kind of surface do I have to use to get to it off the tarmac? And for what distance? Is it going to be usable in the rainy season? Other aspects of that include the topography of the area. If it's near a water body, is it too close to the riparian zone? A place that would potentially get flooded over time?
Explain the riparian zone.
So riparian zones are spaces of land between the high water mark for water bodies, generally referred when you're discussing rivers, but also applicable when you're discussing lakes and oceans and seas and so on. Riparian is a buffer zone stipulated by law that one cannot own or develop even if they own.
Okay. Does Goshen Acquisition own any land that has to apply with this riparian laws?
Yes, absolutely. We have a beautiful 6.85 acre block of land at the front of Lake Elementaita, right next to Surville Resort, that we purchased in 2015. And yes, we do have a riparian buffer. Fortunately for Lake Elementaita, those were very well defined from a while ago. And that zone is managed by KWS. In fact, they manage the lake as part of their trustee duties for the benefit of the people of Kenya. And beyond that, there's a plan to propose extra buffers coming into the private lands where you cannot develop certain ways.
Okay, so when you are perfect, now that you're close to strategic land investment, aka a mass of water that has limited surface area, or call it length. When you went to get the land, when it came to riparian, who did you have a conversation with that with? How did you know?
So riparian lands are generally managed by the Water Resources Authority, formerly known as WARMA, now WRA, and in conjunction with them, in many cases you have to work with NEMA, the National Environmental Management Authority. But primarily WARMA is responsible for defining what the riparian zones are. They will do surveys, they have data, historical data about the ebb and flow of water levels, and therefore what buffer has to be put in place. Yeah, and as general guidelines, for instance, if it's a river, the riparian is automatically supposed to be a minimum of 6 meters on either side of the river. And if the river is wider than 6 meters, you're supposed to do double that, right? The width of the river on either side. So if the river is, say, 10 meters wide, you're supposed to leave 10 meters on either side, right? Up to 30 meters. So if the river is 50 meters wide, you're supposed to leave up to 30 meters on either side, right? So those are fairly clearly defined and generally apply to permanent rivers because those have permanent water. When you have seasonal rivers that are sometimes dry, sometimes wet, that's treated a bit differently, but all that is defined and managed by WARMA.
Okay, so they are the ones who then told you now KWS, and for this specific parcel of Elementaita, that had a bit of difference because of the birds, I would guess. I'd say the animals that are in that space?
So in the instance that we're dealing with, Warma is specific to our proximity to the lake, the water body.
Okay.
So you deal with KWS because the lake happens to be managed by them because of all the wildlife around that ecosystem, specifically the bird life, right? So Lake Elementaita happens to be a UNESCO World Heritage Site because it's home to about 400 bird species, many of which you will not find anywhere else on the planet. So it's a protected zone, hence its UNESCO World Heritage listing. So there's responsibility by the national government and its agencies to manage that ecosystem responsibly, because it doesn't just affect the people local to the area or Kenya, it affects migratory routes spanning continents. Right, so it's for the benefit of humanity in general. That's very important. Now that's a double-edged sword. It has pluses and minuses. Pluses because it's unique, it's protected, it guarantees a certain amount of commercial viability around tourism for the long term, but it also comes with negatives around restrictions on what you can or can't do, especially if you're right next to the lake. So, you know, when you're doing your due diligence, these things will generally come up. If you do your due diligence right, which also includes hiring a licensed surveyor to do a survey report, to check the boundaries of the land as they were shown to you by the seller, to ensure that the boundaries are where they're supposed to be, the beacons are where they're supposed to be, and that the sizes match what the government has on record between paper and ground. And when you do that, a good licensed surveyor will pick up on issues of Warma, NEMA, blah, 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 riparian zones, and the likes.
Okay, so let's go back to this Imbuko land, because that's just the example that we're using in terms of how you did your DD. You've spotted this, you've talked about the proximity to the road. These are all things, all factors that you are considering before now, while you're in the process of deciding, I want this piece of land.
Yep.
So is that the stage where you hired the surveyor?
Yeah, so I generally hire the surveyor after I come to terms with the land seller. So I visited the land, I visited the site, I loved it. And some people ask me, what is it about the site that you liked and made you comfortable? And you know, I tell people very bluntly, it's a feeling. Whether or not we like to admit it, most of our decisions in life are based on a feeling. It feels right, it feels safe, and there's a certain emotional attachment to it. The same goes for when you're buying a car, you're buying a watch, a timepiece, when you're buying your clothes. Yes, then they're well tailored, you like the color, blah, blah, blah. All that in totality gives you a feeling that you're willing to buy into. And it's exactly the same with land, maybe more important with land, because there's certain areas we've scouted for land where the land size was appropriate, the pricing was perfect, the documents were legitimate and clean, but I just didn't like the feeling. I didn't have that internal check. And so I walked away.
And all this other stuff was right.
Yes, I mean, you have to like the place.
Yeah.
So I always like to say it's a feeling.
Okay.
Assuming everything else checks out, because you could have the feeling, but the documents are all crooked. You know, the brothers of the guy who's selling the land.
In fact, let's go there. So you talked about doing due diligence on three different people: the land seller, or the land company, if it's a land company.
Yes.
So let's start then with, because in your case it was you were buying this from the actual owner of the land, or the person who said they're the owner of the land.
Yes.
So how do you start doing the due diligence on the land seller in this case? In fact, let's go there. So you talked about doing due diligence on 3 different people: the land seller, or the land company if it's a land company.
Yes.
So let's start then with, because in your case it was you were buying this from the actual owner of the land, or the person who said they're the owner of the land.
Yes.
So how do you start doing the due diligence on the land seller in this case?
Okay, first thing, I never deal with brokers or agents at that point. Brokers and agents, especially unlicensed ones, are well and good to sort of feel opportunities, but at the point that I'm visiting the site, the landowner has to be present. Otherwise, I'm not interested.
His brother in this case was a land broker.
Yes, in that case, the brother brokered the piece of land in the transaction, but even then, the guy showed up. When I visited the site, I have to meet the landowner. Now, how do I know that they're the landowner? They have to provide me a certified copy of the title deed or show me the original one. I will look at the names and the details imprinted on the title deed. I will ask them for their national ID card and compare. It's a face comparison, very superficial, but that's the first step, because how do you know the guy showing up on the site is the actual landowner? Just because they say they are doesn't make them the landowner.
Yeah.
So their details have to line up on the title deed document. That's the first step. Along with that, I will ask for their KRA PIN certificate, because you will eventually need it at the point of transferring to yourself. And it's also a great due diligence point, because anyone can right now go on KRA's online portal, enter a PIN number, and it'll bring up the name registered to that PIN number. If that name matches with the ID and the title, that's another check.
Oh, nice.
Right, so there's simple things you can do, but we tend to go a bit deeper, because we're risking a lot of capital, borrowed capital, whether from private investors or institutional investors. We cannot have any doubts whatsoever about the ownership and the legitimacy of the documents. So beyond that, we ask for the documents and particulars for the wife or the spouse. So sometimes we're dealing with female land sellers, and they have a husband. We need their details as well as all children over the age of 18.
Whoa.
The reason we do that is because now, constitutionally and as part of the transfer process, you require spousal consent for land to be transferred from one person to the other if the land is currently registered to an individual.
Okay.
They require spousal consent. And the spouse has to swear an affidavit prepared by an advocate, swearing to the fact that they are the spouse legitimately. Ideally, you want to ask them for a marriage certificate or some other form of evidence to corroborate that they are the wife or the husband, right? Because there have been situations where people didn't want their wife to know they were selling off the land, and they paid some random chick to come and pretend to be the wife. And then you have issues later. So we ask for all those documents for the spouse or spouses. In the Maasai culture, it's not uncommon that the man has multiple wives. We must have the documents for all of them, as well as children over 18. On top of that, we like to get the chief and the sub-chief involved to witness and sign off on the sale agreements. So these are all points of reference to just hone in deeper on this issue of who is the actual land seller, because you can't fake ownership from the community, at least not for long.
Yep.
And even in cases where it's possible, we interview the neighbors, because those are the guys who know about family drama that will not show up on a search. So in some cases, you find that the documents check out, you got the nice feeling, everything is fine, but you learn that the guy who's selling you the land received a bigger piece of the family property from their father as inheritance than the two brothers on either side, and they feel some type of way about it. And every time he tries to sell to someone, they show up with pangas and machetes and will not allow you access to the piece of land. So you may very well complete the transaction and legally be the owner of record as far as the government is concerned, but then you can't use the land because of all the drama between siblings and whatnot. So, I like to do deeper due diligence in that regard, especially when you're dealing with an individual. Yeah.
At this time, what external people have you brought in to support you in your
in my diligence. So at that point, I'm dealing with a licensed advocate of the High Court of Kenya. I say that very intentionally because not all advocates are licensed to practice for that year if they haven't renewed their license. It's a minor technicality that could give you massive exposure in the event of problems later, and you're told you weren't even using a licensed advocate. They had not paid their annual license fees to the Law Society of Kenya to practice for that year. Yes, they went to law school, they passed the bar, but they haven't renewed their annual license. So use a licensed advocate of the High Court of Kenya.
So you have to do DD also on the lawyer?
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's documents you ask them for. Give me a copy of your renewed license to practice this year and your license number. From Law Society of Kenya. Now, beyond that, they have to have competence in the field. They have to be, I prefer to use specialists in the conveyancing field, even though most advocates can basically do this in their sleep in general. I find that those who have a focus on this particular type of transaction are a lot more efficient. They have relationships at the registries, they have clerks who can move swiftly to get things done quickly. They know what to troubleshoot for. So you're better off dealing with one who specializes in conveyancing, right? And at this point, I have given them the owner's ID, the PIN certificate, certified copy of the title, if not the original, the spouse's documents. They know how to get in touch with the chief and the sub-chief, and they're the ones conducting the search with the registry. And by this, I mean the simple search. You fill in a form, there's a very specific process, you pay the fee. It's supposed to be free, but in many cases they still expect you to pay a small fee as part of admin costs, especially if your lawyer is using a clerk to go to the registry to get the search reports done. After the search report is out, I ask them to then do one on the green card, because when you do a search, the government looks at the green card in the registry to produce a search report. After that's done, I ask my advocate to ask for a certified copy of the green card, just to make sure that the search certificate I was given matches what's exactly on the green card, and there's no monkey business internally from the registry side.
Okay, somebody may be hearing the word green card for the first time, and where is this even been done? Is this been done in Nairobi? Is this been done in the counties? Is this been, where is the lawyer doing this? For example, and let's just go back to the situation for Kajiado. Yeah, in Buko.
So Imbuko is under Kajiado registry in Kajiado town, Ministry of Lands registry in Kajiado town. My lawyer happens to be officed in Nairobi, which is why, again, I say if you're dealing with one who specializes, they have the internal infrastructure to manage the movement back and forth to wherever is necessary. So in this case, they will do the search in Kajiado registry, lodge the application, the registrar will produce a search certificate, and also they will send the formal letter requesting for the certified copy of the green card to the same registry, right? Because the registry is there. There are several registries throughout the country by zones, so you would have to know which registry you have to do your search in. Yeah, and this is why you need the services of a licensed advocate of the High Court of Kenya. I can't stress that enough. You can't do this stuff on your own. You will not be as efficient, and you need that legal protection.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the green card, when we're having a conversation, you've talked about the green card. Why is this document so important? Don't you already have the title?
Yes, so the green card is in many cases a literal green manila card sitting in a file at the registry. Very limited access to it, usually by the senior registrar and the supporting registrars. No one has simple access to that document, and it contains everything about the property. In actual fact, it is the one that gives birth to your title deed. So just because you have a title deed doesn't mean that all is fine and dandy. If I have a title deed that is not reflected on the green card, then that title deed is useless. It's worthless. Not even worth the piece of paper it's printed on. So, you want to make sure the details in the green card at the registry are accurate and agree with the report that was produced for you.
What are some of the details that are on the green card, if you were to give examples?
Yeah, so a history of ownership generally from 1963, when the government of Kenya took possession of all the lands from the Queen of England within its sovereign territories, down up until now. It'll show who the government sold or gave the lands to, right? It'll show if that person
gave... The first person that the government gave?
Absolutely.
Okay.
From 1963. Some go as way back as 1952. I've seen some for 1950s, especially in Nairobi CBD. But it'll contain the history of ownership, any transaction relating to that title deed or that property throughout history from then until now, whether it's bank charges because they took a loan and didn't pay and it was auctioned, who the new owner was, if there was a fraud case involved, if it was solved, if there was a discharge of the loan, everything will be contained on the green card, which is why it's important that you ask your advocate to requisition formally a certified copy of the green card. Now, that's something you could probably try to do on your own, but it's incredibly difficult as an individual as opposed to using your advocate. Because normally, when a green card is called for, it usually has to do with some fraud investigation. And so we found that over time, every time we tried to ask for one, the registrars would get nervous immediately. Who is asking and why? Why do you want it? Because also if there was foul play or some monkey business internally, they want to sort it out before they produce it, right? If it's a DCI investigation, they're very uneasy about producing that document. But if you're using a licensed advocate who makes a formal request in writing to the registrar, it's a lot simpler because they understand the pretext for asking for it. It's part of due diligence, whatever. And in the event of any monkey business, a licensed advocate is able to deal with it according to the law.
I get it.
Yeah.
Okay. Whew, this is, it's a lot. It's a lot. And definitely I'm beginning to see why you need a licensed representative from LSK. But let me ask this now. I'm sort of understanding you doing due diligence on the person who you are buying land from.
Yeah.
What about if we are buying land from you? So what kind of due diligence do we need to do if an individual is buying land from a company? So like Goshen or GrandAcres. But let me ask this now. I'm sort of understanding you doing due diligence on the person who you are buying land from.
Yeah.
What about if we are buying land from you? So what kind of due diligence do we need to do if an individual is buying land from a company? So like Goshen or GrandAcres.
Yeah, so most of it is exactly the same, except obviously for a company like Goshen Acquisitions, as opposed to giving you an ID, I will give you a certificate of registration for the business, right? That's the equivalent of an ID. I will give you the PIN certificate for the business. I will give you things like CR12s and CR8s, which are disclosures about the shareholding of the business. And it's on that basis that beyond asking for CR12s and so on, later on you can ask for copies of the ID of the directors and their PIN certificates, because they are actually in fact required when we're transferring to you. We have to surrender them to the registry along with board resolutions that we have indeed made a corporate decision to sell this property to you for a specific price, right? Because the company is treated as a separate entity from its shareholders and or directors. But all those documents are still required at the point of transfer. So you want to ask for them anyway, especially if you're working with a licensed advocate. It's done in a controlled and safe manner, because I can tell you for a fact, we will not share copies of our title with anyone who's interested in buying before they have paid us a reservation deposit and engage us formally.
I get
because then otherwise we'd have 1,000 people out there with copies of titles for absolutely no reason, and that's sensitive information. We don't want that floating out there for nothing. So if it's done in a controlled setting using the advocates, then you can ask for specific documents to aid in your due diligence. Yeah.
So now that you've talked about titles, so I mean, I'm beginning to understand the due diligence that needs to be done on a company, but you brought up the conversation on titles. Now, majority of people buying lands have never held a title, never seen a title, have no idea what to look for when they're holding a title. Where can they either A, get this information, or know that these titles are legit?
I mean, that's part of the due diligence through your licensed advocate of the High Court of Kenya. I mean, there's certain things that will generally be easily verifiable. With a certified copy, they can apply for a search and confirm ownership from the registry, just like we did when we were buying. They will also have the freedom to requisition a certified copy of the green card. If their lawyer is worth their salt, they will know to do that. As a standard practice, we do that when we never just deal with a search report. After the search report, we get a certified copy of the green card. And I recommend that for everyone, even our customers. Just do it as a formality. Even if you trust the seller, just get it out of the way so you have complete files. In the event of something else coming up later, you will be able to demonstrate beyond a doubt that you did your due diligence. You were diligent about checking out the legitimacy of documents, history of ownership, blah blah blah.
Okay, I've gotten the documents are legit from the seller, we are good to go. But when I'm on the piece of land and I'm buying 3 acres, my eyes have no idea what 3 acres looks like.
Yes. How
then do I certify that this 3 acres that you're telling me, for example, you said the amount of land that you have in Elementaita is
6.85 acres.
I mean, you broke it down to 0.58 acres.
Yeah.
How do you certify that? Like, what's the process of doing that?
So you as a buyer have the right and the option to get an independent survey done before you conclude the transaction. So by this point, you've paid a deposit. Ideally, you paid it to escrow if it's not an entity that's well known and easy to find. You want to pay as much as you can to escrow. In some cases, that's not always possible because the seller doesn't want to deal with escrow. In that case, you need to make a judgment call. Do I trust the seller enough to pay the deposit to them? Is there some accountability mechanism in the event that I want to pull out or not? But in general, it's best practice to pay funds into escrow.
When people are buying land from Goshen Acquisitions, do they pay to escrow?
In some instances, yes, and I'll explain the difference. So for transactions where we are pre-selling, like we did in Nanyuki, where we pre-sold half acres to a number of customers before the titling process of our subdivision was done, they paid funds to escrow. Even we were not comfortable taking their funds directly because we were not done with the titling process. And as it turned out, it was a wise decision because we've had delays with producing title deeds. And therefore, for the buyers who feel like they want to pull out because it's taken too long, it's no fault of ours. We're having challenges with some authorities and we have to go through a legal process for that. But a customer may not want to wait, in which case they can pull out of the transaction, as is their contractual right to, and their funds are there to be refunded. Now, if they didn't pay to escrow, there's a high risk that we as a company who need to pay salaries and all manner of overheads, rents, and so on, have used your money to run the business. You decide you don't want to wait any longer, even though it's no fault of our own, and we're unable to refund you. That becomes a messy predicament. So it's always good to pay into escrow, especially when you're buying property that is not ready to transfer, right? So in that instance, we use escrow and we have no issue with it. In some instances, like we are in Imbuko, we're receiving funds directly because everything is ready to go.
You hold titles?
We hold title. The titles are held by the advocate. The sellers can easily confirm this particular fact with their advocates, and the transaction size is also not that big. If you're dealing with a multi-million shilling transaction, no matter how much you trust the other individual, you want things held in escrow until certain conditions are met and you're on the clear.
Okay, so when okay, let's go back to this Imbuko piece of land, and I'm just using this as an example.
Yeah.
In case anybody's listening. So when do you now put pen to paper? So when do agreements start getting signed? For example, when you are buying this parcel of land, and when does funds begin to get transferred?
Yeah, so to initiate a transaction, you have to do your due diligence. In my experience, due diligence will start before and complete after you sign a sale agreement, because certain things take time. And if you're sure you like the piece of land, the price is right, you like the owner, you've come to terms, you need to show good faith and goodwill by paying a deposit to initiate the transaction and to prevent the seller from selling to someone else.
Yep.
Right? Because while you're twiddling your thumbs thinking about this, that, or the other, someone else came along and pulled the trigger before you and the opportunity is gone. So you want to tie it up as quickly as you safely can by paying a deposit. According to the Law Society of Kenya's conditions for sale, a 10% deposit is the required minimum amount to make your sale agreement legally binding.
Okay.
Right? So you pay at least 10%, or if it's more, you and the seller have agreed. 10%, you sign a sale agreement approved by yourself and your advocate. It has to be professionally prepared. I have seen sale agreements that were a joke, that protected neither party. So you want to use licensed advocates, preferably those who specialize in conveyancing, as I've said a million times before, because they know what clauses to put in there for everyone's protection and safety. And it's at that point that you can say you have a live transaction.
Okay. What kind of protection as the buyer should I put in place?
So the most will have to do with vacant possession. That's an important one for me. If I'm buying a piece of land that happens to have squatters on it, I will make it the seller's responsibility to clear that matter out before the property is transferred to me and I pay the balance. Until then, I'm not interested. Squatter issues are messy and they can tie you up for years. So they have to guarantee that they will give you vacant possession, meaning there's no one on the property except yourself. Right? That's an important one. The other one is giving yourself enough time to complete the transaction. This is a matter of agreement or predetermined by the seller. For instance, when we have ready titles to go like we do in Imbuko, we don't like to wait more than 45 days for the balance, because typically within 30 to 40 days, we have received the Land Control Board consent to transfer and have already transferred the title or have handed over completion documents to your advocate. And this is the third part, completion documents, very important. It's a list of all the original documents required to effect a transfer from us to you. And this is the third part, completion documents, very important. It's a list of all the original documents required to effect a transfer from us to you, by law. That includes the original title deed, original copy of the title deed, includes spousal affidavits for spousal consents, includes passport photos, includes identification documents and PIN certificates, includes signed transfer documents. When you do a transfer of property, there's actually a form called a transfer form, containing the details and images of both parties, the details of the transaction in terms of value.
And that document is given by the by the county government?
No, that document has been prepared by the Ministry of Lands in a particular format. And most lawyers will have it. They will prepare it. Both parties have to sign it. In your case, it's more important that I have signed than you, because you can sign it whenever you want, but I have to sign it. We also tend to ask for certified copies of the mutation form for the property.
That's the whole subdivision and
the
all
subdivision scheme and how we produce that piece of land. So the other document we have to include in the completion documents is called the registry index map. It has to be a certified copy, or the RIM, or the RIM. The reason we include that as a requirement in the completion documents, very important in your sale agreement, is because now going forward, as the country digitizes the title deeds under the unified system, that registry index map is more important than your actual title deed. I've done an episode about this before, including with Caroline Mutoko, where we explained the import of that. But people can also visit Ardhi Sasa, which is the Ministry of Lands online portal, to understand the process. Because if they call upon you to get your title deed digitized at some point in the near future, hopefully, they will require you to bring your original title deed, your identification documents, your ID, PIN certificate, just as we do when we're buying, and the registry index map.
So somebody who's hearing about RIM for the first time, what is this?
So all that parcel of land known as the Republic of Kenya and its sovereign boundaries is mapped, and it's mapped by grid systems and regions and locations. And these, in their smallest form, are called registry index maps, right? Anything smaller than that would have to be a deed plan or a mutation form. A deed plan and a mutation form are the same thing for the different title tenures. Deed plans will generally be for leasehold titles, and mutation forms are generally for agricultural, freehold type of titles and properties. Now, what the government is doing with the digitization process is getting rid of deed plans and mutation forms as reference documents on properties. They are unifying the new title deed regime by cross-referencing with a registry index map, because the registry index map will contain your property clearly illustrated on it, along with the neighboring parcels or blocks of land for a larger area.
That's so cool, though.
So yeah, absolutely.
That's to our advantages as landowners.
Because if your property has a title deed, but for some reason is not indicated or illustrated clearly on the registry index map or the RIM, or AKA the RIM, then there's a chance that you might have paid for thin air, because the RIM is what proves that the piece of land in its shape and dimensions exist within the boundaries of Kenya as part of its land mass.
Okay.
That makes sense, right? This is why that document is extremely important. In fact, in my view, and I'll say it here, in terms of order of priority, the most important document in any property transaction is a green card. Green card. Now, the green cards also have white cards associated with them, but green card is sufficient. Number two, most important, is your registry index map, and then your title deed comes in third. Right? So you want to make sure that as part of your completion documents that we have to provide you, before you finish your transaction by paying us a balance or releasing your balance from escrow to us includes a registry index map.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Okay, so during a site visit, I presume that I should do as a land buyer, always go and visit your parcel of land.
Yes.
Do I need to ask them for this RIM?
Absolutely. If they don't have the RIM, they need to get that thing sorted out before we get to the point of payments, or I walk away. It's a point of no negotiation for me. So if the property is not indicated on the registry index map they show you, or they don't have the registry index map, it could mean one of two things. Number one, the property is legit, it's clean and everything, but for whatever reason, the surveyor who handled its production did not complete the process after the title deed was produced and have the registry index map amended to include that parcel of land clearly indicated or illustrated. If that's the case, then you can require them to have that completed before you make payment. Right? If someone's unwilling to do that, it's not worth the risk, because you could be paying for thin air. Just because it has a title deed doesn't mean jack. And I can't stress that enough. I've talked about it. I know it sounds alarming sometimes, but it's a fact. Your title deed is quite literally the most useless document in that chain of documents I just called the completion documents, because it's simply a token representing a set of documents, many of which are in the back office at the registry that you don't have access to. So if the RIM is not indicating my property, either they didn't complete the process, in which case they can and should, or the property literally does not exist within the boundaries of Kenya. So I walk away.
And have you seen this happen? Have you seen instances where a title deed is actually useless?
Absolutely. Happens all the time, all day long, every day, probably. You know, it's sad, but this is a reality. People are generally impatient around any services requiring government involvement, because the government can be slow in its service delivery. I mean, in essence, it's the largest corporate we have to deal with. They manage a lot and there's inefficiencies. That's a fact. But that should not excuse you skipping a step or paying a bribe to skip a step for the sake of getting to your end zone. You have to make sure all these documents are in place, or else you could be getting conned. And this has to do with the seller's attitude and energy when you're transacting with them. If a seller will put pressure on you to complete without some of these critical documents in place, that is unreasonable, then you just have to take a second look or walk away. I mean, it's that simple. It's not worth the risk. If you have any respect for the money you have saved and put together or borrowed and compounded from other people, you cannot skip a single step in that process. Okay,
so I've got this document, I've paid my deposit. I've paid my deposit before. When should I've paid my deposit. We've entered the sale agreement.
Yep.
All these documents have been gathered. You're telling me this process, if the titles were created, should normally take 45 days. What is happening at that time from the person who I'm buying a parcel of land? What are they doing at this time? We've entered the sale agreement.
Yep.
All these documents have been gathered. You're telling me this process, if the titles were created, should normally take 45 days. What is happening at that time from the person who I'm buying a parcel of land? What are they doing at this time?
So first of all, I'll say that the Law Society of Kenya conditions of sale recommends 90 days.
Oh, it's 90 days
to complete. That is not a law. It's a policy recommendation. The reason for that is because it accounts for enough time to go through subdivisions if you're hiving it off from a larger block of land, blah, 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 to get the titles deeds out, etc., right? So it's a recommendation. That can go longer than 90 days. We've done transactions where the sellers allowed us even a year to complete, right? We've done transactions which were completed in 30 days or less. So it's simply a question of both parties agreeing, but LSK recommends 90 days. The reason I mentioned 45 days for our Imbuko project, for instance, is because we have ready transferable titles. All we are required to go do at that point, because we have RIMs, mutation forms, because that's just how we do stuff. We do it right and everything's tight. We have to go get a land control board consent to transfer the property to you, because it is still a freehold property. You have to deal with the land control board, right? The land control boards for Imbuko are held in a place called Mashuru. It's this sub-county region of Kajiado County. They meet once a month, usually the last Wednesday of each month. So depending on when we transact with you, for instance, if you paid us yesterday, the 21st of March, which is a Monday, that happens to be 7 days in advance of the next land control board hearing for Mashuru. Formal policy is you have to book 7 business days before the actual land control board hearing. Miss. Right? Now, if you happen to pay us last week, we could book for the land board hearing to get their consent to transfer to you. The seller is the one who needs to get consent, always. To transfer, to subdivide, to change particulars on a title, change name, whatever. You need the land control board's permission. If you paid us a deposit on Friday, we would have booked yesterday on Monday.
That falls in line with the 7 days.
Yes, ahead. We go to
7 business working days. So Friday, Saturday,
7 working days.
Saturday,
so you don't count
Saturday and Sunday out.
Yeah. We attend the land control board hearing on Wednesday of next week, the 30th of March. They give us a consent to transfer, ideally. They could also deny, and they'll give you reasons why. Usually they are fixable problems and you come back again.
What will some of those problems be?
Legal
problems.
You haven't presented all the documents, including a spousal consent.
Oh.
Yeah, if it's a seller selling, you haven't produced company board resolution saying that the company has agreed, because the company has directors and shareholders. It's a separate entity. The company has to agree to sell to you at a particular price, and you didn't produce that. In that case, they could either choose to defer you to the next hearing or give you a conditional approval, as long as you provide those documents within a few hours or a day or whatever, you're able to agree with them. But presumably we get the consent on Wednesday of next week. We lodge all these documents plus surrender the original title deed in our name to the land registry in Kajiado town, and they register the new title. That registry can be quite efficient. We've had titles done in about 14 days or less. It could take longer, but in theory, 14 days into April is only about
20 something days,
35 days from now. So therefore, it would not be unreasonable for us to expect that you pay your balance at that point, because we have completed everything.
And do they give you documents ensuring that the process has happened? A receipt? Is there once you lodge in the documents?
Yes, they give you what they call a registration receipt. It'll have the details of the property. They stamp it. It'll have other notes on it, and that's what you use when you're going to follow up to see if the title is ready. You present that.
Okay.
It's a receipt that they've received the completion documents, and that's what you use. Now, after they complete, they'll simply give you the original title and copies of the transfer forms that have been franked. It's a technical term for authenticated. Each registry has to frank the transfer documents. It'll have a valuation component there for payment of stamp duty by your buyer, which hopefully agrees with your land control board application and your declaration on the transfer document. All these details need to line up.
And all this is being done by the seller and the seller's lawyer. So as the buyer, you're waiting for them to present these documents? Who pays stamp duty?
Depending on what you agreed. So some sellers would prefer, because it's easier for them, that your lawyer completes registration, you present them their title, they pay you the balance. In some cases, all we obligate ourselves to do is hand over completion documents, a full set, to your lawyer, and they complete the registration process, because at that point the ownership can happen without any further reference to us. Right? Your lawyer handles it, because some lawyers are particular about how they do it, especially if they want to make sure there was no bribes paid, it's ethically done, and so on. They might want to control that to their own satisfaction, and that's a wrap. We get paid, they have the completion documents, and it's done. Issues of stamp duty can also be negotiated, but as far as KRA is concerned, the transferee, the person receiving the new title, is responsible for paying a stamp duty.
Whoa.
The buyer pays a stamp duty.
Okay, so what are all the hidden costs that come in? So stamp duty is one hidden cost.
Yes, it's only hidden because it's usually not included as your purchase price, unless we as a seller have said the price is inclusive of stamp duty and lawyer fees, right? But that is one of the so-called hidden, or I'd like to call them closing costs.
Okay.
It's a cost for closing the transaction. You pay the stamp duty to the government of Kenya, you get a receipt for the exact amount, and it's based on the valuation put on the transfer form by the government valuer, right? And it was franked, right? In some cases, you can actually negotiate with the seller to pay your stamp duty for you. As far as KRA is concerned, it'll still be on your account with them, but the money came out of my pocket. You know what I mean? That's a point of negotiation, but standard practice is stamp duty is paid by the buyer, the transferee.
Okay.
And then in addition to that, obviously whatever your lawyer is charging you in legal fees.
I get it.
Yeah.
So where do I, as the buyer, give what would be a safe place for me as the buyer to pay the rest of the deposit? I mean the outstanding balance.
When all completion documents have been given to your lawyer, that's the first option, or when the title deed and all its related documents are surrendered to you or to your lawyer.
Okay.
Presumably at that point, if you're dealing with a smart seller like Goshen Acquisitions, we will require that your deposit already be in escrow, or your balance already be in escrow, right? So that we are transferring your property knowing we're not going to have to chase you for the money after ownership has already changed.
Yep.
Because that could be a nightmare, right? We've lost a property in essence and haven't been paid. To avoid that, we require your balance in full in escrow, or in some cases even with us, depending on the relationship with the buyer.
Yep.
So it's at that point that you hand over. Either completion documents have been given to your lawyer, or the transferred title deed in your favor has been released to you or your lawyer.
Okay. Just a couple of questions as we continue. Number one, as somebody from the diaspora, as a Kenyan in the diaspora buying land, what are the biggest things that I need to watch out for to prevent getting conned? Number one, as somebody from the diaspora, as a Kenyan in the diaspora buying land, what are the biggest things that I need to watch out for to prevent getting conned?
There are many, man. It's a minefield. First of all, if you're not here to do a site visit, you have to be fairly confident that information presented to you is accurate and genuine. I know a lot of people in the diaspora don't like to involve family or friends for one reason or another. They've been conned by friends and family before because of the trust element, and so they just want to do their own thing privately. You have to be very confident at that point that Goshen Acquisitions or whoever else has presented accurate information. That generally is easy to tell from the onset based on your interaction with the seller. What was their attitude? What information are they willing to share? Questions being answered, and so on and so forth. You can basically tell if you can trust them or not. Ideally, you want to send someone on your behalf to site to do a site visit and confirm that the situation on ground is as was presented to you on a brochure or on the website or on the TV ad, whatever way it was that you found out about it. That's the first one. The second one has to do with the due diligence. Many don't know what to look out for. They have to rely on the seller to be honest in making certain disclosures, but if they don't know what to look out for, they don't even know what has been disclosed or not. So have a licensed advocate of the High Court of Kenya handle this for you. Get referrals. In some cases, our buyers will ask us, can you recommend any good ones? Because we've kissed enough frogs to have found our princesses. We know which good lawyers to work with, and we're happy to recommend that they work with another one if they don't want to use ours, which is well within their rights. If a seller decides by default for you that you have to use their lawyer, generally that's an off-putting sign for me, because you have no control whatsoever about what's being done on the back end to expose you in the future. You want to have a measure of control, right? So always work with a licensed advocate, whether it's your own or if you're sharing the same one for the seller. They have to give you the necessary undertakings about how they're handling your money and so on, right? So that's I find is the biggest one around the mistakes made by people in the diaspora.
Okay, and I think also the escrow. Just a question about the escrow, especially if you're the diaspora. The escrow is a good protection for you. Absolutely. The escrow account is an account used exclusively for custodial purposes, meaning it's an account usually owned by the lawyer to hold funds for both parties in a transaction. Right? Now, if you send money to escrow, always, every single time ensure that the lawyer in charge of the escrow account has issued you what is called a professional undertaking. It's a letter of them giving you the conditions upon which the funds shall move out of that account as a basic minimum. That document, that one-pager document, in many cases, is a difference between heaven or hell for a buyer, because if they move funds out of that account that exposes you or causes loss or injury to you, then they can be handled by the Law Society of Kenya. Disciplinary action can be taken, including disbarment and them losing their license to practice any further. But the escrow account exists specifically for that reason, to hold your funds in safety for your protection as well as for us as a seller, because we don't want to go through the rigors of getting approvals to transfer a property to you. Ownership changes and we're left hanging because we want paid, right? So in that instance, we will also want to know from the lawyer, yes, we have received X amount from the seller into escrow. Here's the balance. Here's a proof, whether it's a bank statement or a payment receipt, whatever it is. Both parties can be comfortable knowing that when certain conditions are met, funds are released. Okay. One last question, just before we do a pattern shot. I mean, this conversation can go on for another 7 hours.
Easy.
Just because of the how deep we can get into escrow and who should have access and all of these other questions, into the title deed and the features there, into due diligence. This is just like an overview, and for more information, I mean, you've been seeing www.goshenacquisitions.com. You can also check out their YouTube channel, Own Land in Kenya, where they break down a whole lot more of this. one last thing, I just want you to sort of like have a conversation with somebody who may have enjoyed this class and session. They're thinking about buying land. Again, I'll ask you, why do you think that Kenyans should buy land? What would you say to somebody who's on the fence in terms of participating in this whole wealth ownership conversation? Actually, before I ask that question, I want to talk about a big one: corruption in the land process in Kenya. We can't negate that, especially in this. That's probably one of the reasons why people are so scared. I know you have answered questions on how people can curb and prevent it from happening or catch it. What are your thoughts on, or what would you have to say about corruption? Because I'm sure it's brought about delays, it's brought about hardship. What are your thoughts on corruption in Kenya in terms of land buying? What are your thoughts on, or what would you have to say about corruption? Because I'm sure it's brought about delays, it's brought about hardship. What are your thoughts on corruption in Kenya in terms of land buying?
I mean, it's pervasive, like with every other sector. Unfortunately, that's become part of our normal life as Kenyans. It's a horrible thing for me as a Kenyan citizen to say and admit on camera, but it's a situation, and it's incredibly problematic. It's hurting a lot of people. It's making the cost of doing business unnecessarily high. Not only that, immoral. So for those of us to whom it matters that we live our lives or do business ethically and have peace in our consciences about doing the right thing, it's a problem. And it can be very costly in time, especially when you resist those pressures to pay a bribe to get something done. It's real. I mean, most of us in the business, even lay people just trying to transact with each other, are very often held hostage by government officials, whether on the national level or a county level, to pay bribes, or else their transactions don't get completed. And you can imagine a situation where someone is selling off land to pay a loved one's hospital bill. The pressure is real. I mean, the 100K, the 20K, the 50K, in our case, the 2 million shillings that was demanded as a bribe to issue a certain permission that would allow a transaction to close, can be materially impactful. And so I understand the pressure a lot of people go through, but I do know this as a basic human being, no matter what your creed or beliefs and thoughts are in life, we all want to do things right. We want peaceful consciences around our transactions. So, even those who are, they budget for the bribery amount as a regular part of business cost, don't want to. They want to do it clean. And so I understand the pressures, but at the end of the day, we have to do what is right and demand that those in authority provide us services without holding us hostage and forcing us to pay immoral and illegal bribes. It's not just immoral, it's also illegal. Ethical standards as per the Constitution are very high on this particular issue. So we have to step up as a citizenry, as a people being served, to demand better of those serving us in government. Okay, and just because you brought that up, as a participator in facilitating land acquisitions, basically you are a land seller. Part of the problem, or part of the reason why a lot of people have lost a lot of money, is not just the corrupt government officials. It is also the people who are participating in this on behalf of us who are trying to buy land.
For example, selling parcels of land that they shouldn't be selling in areas that they shouldn't be selling. Yep. I'll use the word eighths of, as people know them, or even sixteenths, or however small they can
50
get.
by 100.
Yes.
Yes.
Let's have a conversation about that, because we are coming to you to buy land. So we come to Goshen, and I'm not using Goshen as an example. I'm just using it as a representative of that sector. How can we protect ourselves as land?
As buyers and investors? It's a great question. I mean, it's one of my greatest pains on this journey, is understanding the implications of what we do as land sellers and land developers and so on, land trading companies. We have a higher standard to meet as far as the products we are selling and providing for our clientele. And I also understand where that pressure comes from, because you want to make your product as affordable as possible for every person to access, right? It's a very idealistic view. And a lot of people have fought back against us when we've made these comments, because they say, oh, you're trying to be elitist, we need affordable land for everyone's pocket. Absolutely, 1,000,000%, I agree. But to what extent should we ignore the law and what's right to provide everyone an equal opportunity to buy land? I mean, it's unrealistic to expect that everyone should be able to afford any piece of land that they want. Right? There's a reason, one piece of land is priced at 100K per acre. There's a reason why an acre in Westlands is going for 400, 500 million shillings. So should we be complaining that the acre in Westlands is inaccessible for most of us? That it should be split up to enough sizes that I can afford it for $1 million bucks. I mean, there's rhyme and reason for these things. But I understand the pressure that land sellers have to provide mass market appealing products. But the reality is we all have to play within a set of rules as espoused by the law, specifically the Physical Land Use and Planning Act 2019, in conjunction with the various county policies for zoning and user. In Kenya, we use the term user. It means the same thing as zoning. What is the area and the size permitted for where you're buying? The buyer has a responsibility to do their due diligence to know that, hey, I'm buying an acre in Imbuko. Is an acre allowed in Imbuko by Kajiado County? And if it's allowed, what must Goshen Acquisitions have done to cause it to be allowed? And have they followed that process to the latter? Because if we haven't and you buy, you run the risk of losing your land at some point in a random future, should someone want to straighten things out. You know what I mean? The onus is on you as a buyer, sadly, to know your stuff, know your business. You can't be blind about it and overly trusting of a land seller, because we have extremely high motivation to sell you that piece of land. And most of it has to do with profitability. So you need to do your homework and know what's supposed to happen, which is why we spend a lot of time sharing information on Own Land in Kenya, our YouTube channel, about how to go about the process of due diligence. Your licensed advocate should be able to help you with that, specific to the county, because that's a reality today under the devolved governance structure. The counties have absolute authority on issues of zoning and user. What land sizes are permitted where and for what use. So if I'm going to sell you a 50 by 100 commonly advertised, you need to know whether that size is permitted for that location for the use I am advertising. Because then you could be buying something that has absolutely no value to you whatsoever in the long term. And I've said this before, sadly, this is the reality. Most of us selling 50 by 100s are simply because we haven't followed due process. We have not provided the infrastructure required, including wastewater and sewer treatment and management, solid waste management, drainage, road and accessibility, power and water reticulation, supporting infrastructure like for security, police posts, shopping areas, schools, hospitals, because the bigger you go in scale, the more important these things become. Just look at Tattoo City and the amazing work they're doing. There's a reason you have to pay whatever it is, 20, 40 million bobs, 40 million bobs for half an acre, because they have done the work and it's taken this long and it has cost them X amount of money. These are serious issues. And so if we're going to be serious about investing and building real wealth in the long term, we as buyers have to be a bit more knowledgeable about what we're buying and why we're buying it, and holding the seller accountable. Ask for the permits, ask for the documents, the proof that they produced it legally before you risk your capital.
Whew. Thank you, Solomon, for just, taking, this is part one. I feel like I need to come back to you and just have deeper conversations about now, how do we add value into the land? What are some of the ways that we should market this land to reach a certain audience? We've been doing amazing things with Sauti Sol and Caroline Toko, Just Ivy, and a whole bunch of people. Thank you for coming to the platform. There's still so much. I feel like this is just part one of your class and session. I know that this is just part one of your class and session.
Yeah.
As a parting shot, how does it feel to hand over a title deed to somebody?
It's hard to describe, man. It's a culmination of a lot of effort, sweat, tears, prayers, hopes being fulfilled. Not just for us, but for the buyer. You know, we had one client from the diaspora, a very nice gentleman from Boston. I'll even say his name, Mr. Dera, or Doctor. This man trusted us in a very unusual way. He was on layover on his way to some other part of the world, asked me to meet him at the airport to have a conversation about a brochure he saw somewhere. This was for Nanyuki, and he was curious. And normally I would not do that, because why would I go out of my way to travel somewhere? I had to meet him in the CBD. Specifically, it was supposed to be a quick meeting, ended up being a 4-hour conversation almost, about his horrible experience getting conned several times before. And he changed his plans immediately, came to Nanyuki. I had to dash him back to the airport to catch his next flight. And he purchased a couple of plots. But I remember something he said to me before we parted ways. He said, "Solomon, thanks for making time and taking me to see the site. I have a better understanding of what exactly it is you're offering. Please do me a favor. Please don't con me. If you con me after the last 2-3 times, you'll have killed it for me back home forever. I can't survive another episode." And that was a heavy weight for me. I felt it because it matters to me, also as an ex-diaspora, and I understand where he was coming from. So every time we get to hand over a title deed to a buyer, I have indescribable joy, peace, and fulfillment, knowing that we have completed the circle, especially because we do it ethically, we do it clean. Imbuko has taken us 5 years to get approved. It took the intervention of prayers and people organizing for meetings of appeal to avoid paying bribes, as we were being pressured to do. So to come full circle and hand over the title deed to a buyer, it's indescribable, man. It's a privilege, it's a sacred honor we take very seriously, and we're grateful that we get to do that on a daily basis.
For more information, visit www.GoshenAcquisitions.com. Check out Own Land in Kenya, the YouTube channel, and have a blessed day.
Hi, I'm Solomon Wangwe, Managing Director and founder of Goshen Acquisitions Limited and its wholly owned subsidiary GrandAcres Limited, and you're watching Class in Session.